Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the discussion video for July's chapters of Our Mutual Friend. If you do not know, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style serialised read-along of Our Mutual Friend. This has been going on for, I think, over a year now, probably, and we're reading a few chapters every month of Charles Dickens' novel Our Mutual Friend. This month we read 3 chapters of Our Mutual Friend, which were the last 3 chapters in Book 3 out of 4 of Our Mutual Friend. Chapter 15, The Golden Dustman at his worst, a glorious chapter. Chapter 16, The Feast of the Three Hobgoblins, another wonderful chapter, and Chapter 17, A Social Chorus, also wonderful. The Golden Dustman at his worst is one of my favourite chapters ever, and I love it. It's one of the emotional climaxes of the book, and I'm so excited to talk to you about it today. So, Chapter 15, The Golden Dustman at his worst. This is such a wonderful chapter. Like, I literally wrote yay in the margins of the book because this is how much I love this chapter and it brings me great joy. I think it's such a wonderful turning point in the book. It's such an important climactic moment. It's so wonderful in terms of the changing presentation of Bella as a person and of her characterisation, because I think she has a very interesting narrative arc over the course of the book. So, what happens in The Golden Dustman at his worst? Quite simply, Mr. Boffin, now having been informed by Mrs. Lamley that Bella Wilfer had been proposed to by Mr. Rokesmith, the secretary, he decides to dismiss Mr. Rokesmith. He calls in Bella, Mr. Rokesmith and Mrs. Boffin. He says that he's going to write Bella, and he dismisses Mr. Rokesmith from his employment and accuses Mr. Rokesmith of speculating on Bella effectively and of coming out of his station to propose to her when what she wanted and what she deserved was money only. Mr. Rokesmith defends himself and says that he loves Bella honestly and truly, and that this was not to do with speculation, and he also criticises Mr. Boffin for his treatment of him and says that he is glad to go. As Mr. Rokesmith goes to leave, Mr. Boffin says to Bella that she has now been righted, and then Bella, in what is like my favourite moment in the book, I think, Bella starts up from her seat and says, "Oh, make me poor again, someone, I beg and pray, or my heart will break." After Mr. Rokesmith leaves, she tells the Boffins that she is leaving their house for good, that she cannot stay there anymore, and that she is going back to be with her parents. And she leaves the house that night and goes in search of her father. Points of interest in this chapter. This could be interesting analysis, but it's more like to me just me like reading the speeches that I love, because I find it such an interesting chapter, and it's so interesting as well with stuff that happens later that I can't talk about, which I wish I could talk about, and maybe I'll talk about that later, but I think it's such an interesting chapter, and it's got a very odd tone to it. One of the things I really enjoy about this chapter is how strange the tone is, because it veers massively between being really emotional, really earnest and sincere. The speeches that Mr. Rokesmith and also that Bella has are really sincere, really important. There are these moments of great emotional significance in this chapter, but also it's quite melodramatic, it's quite farcical. Some of the things that Mr. Boffin says are just like mad. Meow, says the cat. Quack, quack, says the duck. Bow, wow, wow, says the dog. Win her affections and possess her heart. Meow, quack, quack, bow, wow. Like, what the hell is happening there? What on earth is Mr. Boffin saying? Similarly, a few pages before that, in the bit where Mr. Rokesmith is having his sort of beautiful, incredible speech where he's talking about how much he loves Bella, and then Mr. Boffin just kind of interrupts talking about how much Mr. Rokesmith loves money, and then it goes back to Mr. Rokesmith's beautiful language. It's such an odd chapter tonally. Similarly, the way Bella is described in this chapter, her speeches are so moving, so poetical, and she does something so morally important and so significant, and she makes a stand. Like, I love the way she behaves in this chapter, and I think one of the reasons why I find her such an interesting character of Dickens's, why I find her one of Dickens's most interesting female characters, is the way she behaves in this chapter and the way she stands up for morality, and also that she sees in Mr. Boffin now the faults that she has had, and she declines to have them because she wants to be better than that, and she knows that actually underneath it she is. And I love that. I think it's wonderful, and I think there are points in this chapter where Dickens describes her in a way that is, you know, incredible. The way that Dickens makes Bella behave in this chapter and the language she has at her disposal makes her so powerful and so strong and so important, and yet she also cries and laughs a lot at the same time in a weird hysterical way, stabs her foot a lot, and not just her foot, her little foot, of course, because Dickens likes to describe Bella as little a lot, in a way that is kind of diminishing of what she's doing. It's an odd tone, and I kind of forgot on this bit, but Dickens does sort of simultaneously show Bella in this chapter as being this massive force of strength, but also diminishes her in some of his descriptions, which is unpleasant and problematic, but also really, really interesting, I think, especially in light of other stuff in this book. I just think it's really, really interesting to look at. The juxtaposition of tone and language in this chapter, yes, makes some strange readings, and yes, is to a certain extent problematic in terms of the presentation of Bella, but it also serves a very important purpose in this chapter. The language that is beautiful in this chapter, the bits that are wonderful and lovely to read, are the speeches by Mr. Rokesmith and Bella, and if you look at the poetical language of Mr. Rokesmith in comparison to the kind of coarse and rude, and I guess like by Victorian standards vulgar language that Mr. Boffin is using, the difference in their tone and their words as well as in their meaning, it's very, very important, because Dickens is showing you through their language in a way that, as Bella says later, Mr. Rokesmith is worth a million of Mr. Boffin. Mr. Rokesmith is a much better man, and therefore he is granted that kind of poetry, and Bella as well is granted that kind of poetry, which she doesn't always have. I mentioned in a previous video of the Our Mutual Friends series how a few chapters earlier, when Bella and Lizzie meet for the first time, they have a long discussion in which Lizzie speaks in a very, very poetic way and Bella speaks in a way that is completely unpoetic, and there is that contrast between them that's really important. Bella, for the most part, her dialogue is not poetic. She's not a poetic person and makes use of a lot of language and imagery that is definitely not poetic. And this is the same in parts of this chapter. When Bella says later on in this chapter, if any true friend and well-wisher could make you bankrupt, you would be a duck, but as a man of property you are a demon. That is more typical of Bella's language in this book, and yet the way she speaks to Mr. Rokesmith is much more poetical, and it's really interesting that at this moment of her transformation, her kind of moral transformation, Dickens grants her this kind of poetry that she doesn't normally have. Don't part with me till I have said one other word to do you justice. The only fault you can be truly charged with in having spoken to me as you did that night, with how much delicacy and how much forbearance no one but I can know or be grateful to you for, is that you laid yourself open to be slighted by a worldly shallow girl whose head was turned and who was quite unable to rise to the worth of what you offered her. Mr. Rokesmith, that girl has often seen herself in a pitiful and poor life since, but never in so pitiful and poor a light as now, and the mean tone in which she answered you, sordid and vain girl that she was, has been echoed in her ears by Mr. Boffin. Perhaps poetic is not quite the right word, but there is some beautiful quality in the language she speaks in this chapter that Bella's dialogue doesn't usually have, and I think that's really, really interesting because it does kind of go with her moral transformation. She talks in this chapter more like Lizzie would talk. It all ties up with this idea of Lizzie being this kind of massive moral influence who has created and changed Bella, who has made Bella more moral, and therefore she gets to a point in this chapter where she respects and loves Mr. Rokesmith more than she could ever like and respect the Boffins anymore, after Mr. Boffin has changed so much. Similarly, the way Mr. Boffin talks about things and his constant use of the word money, his repetition of the word money, is partly what brings Bella to this kind of turning point, because she sees, when put into his words, how awful her viewpoint has sometimes been. This lady was far above you. This young lady was no match for you. This young lady was lying in wait, as she was qualified to do, for money, and you had no money. This young lady was looking about the market for a good bid. She wasn't in it to be snapped up by fellows that had no money to lay out with, nothing to buy with. I know this young lady, and we all three know that it's money she makes a stand for. Money, 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 and that you and your affections and heart are a lie, sir. When Mr. Boffin says things like this, one, we see the contrast between his just like awful, oh, money is great, and his coarse way of talking about marriage as a market, as buying and selling. The contrast between him and Mr. Rokesmith's language of love is very, very clearly put across in this chapter, and it does, I think, make Bella see, I guess, the sordidness of how she has thought, the baseness of how she has thought for so many months and years, believing that money is greater than anything else and that money can be more important than anything else. And it is, in many ways, this chapter is a moment of self-discovery and realisation, a turning point for Bella in terms of her life and her priorities. It's interesting, Mr. Boffin says that he is going to right Bella, he is going to set things to right with her, he is going to put her in the right again. And in a way, she is righted. He rights her in that he makes her right, because the way he describes things and the way that he describes what her attitude has been makes her see how bad that attitude was and makes her more moral, more good, more right than she has been. And of course it's very, very interesting that it is as much Mr. Boffin's coarse language as it is Mr. Rokesmith's beautiful language that does this for Bella. And on that note, I'd better read some of Mr. Rokesmith's beautiful speeches because I love him, and because I think that these speeches are the reason why this is my favourite chapter in many ways, and also the reason why I forgive Mr. Rokesmith, because he's a problematic character, because He lies to everyone all the time. Across this chapter and the next chapter, he becomes engaged to Bella Wilfer, and he still doesn't tell her who he is or what his real name is. Obviously, he does get caught up in all of these lies kind of by accident to begin with, but I do think that it is very, very problematic. And yet these speeches, I think, and his earnestness in this chapter can kind of make me forgive him. Because he genuinely does really love Bella, despite all the rest of the chaos and confusion in his life. "I have borne," said the secretary in a low voice, "with my false position here, that I might not be separated from Miss Wilfer. To be near her has been a recompense to me from day to day, even for the undeserved treatment I have had here, and for the degraded aspect in which she has often seen me. Since Miss Wilfer rejected me, I have never again urged my suit to the best of my belief with a spoken syllable or a look, but I have never changed in my devotion to her, except, if she will forgive me for saying so, that it is deeper than it was and better founded. My feeling for Miss Wilfer is not one to be ashamed of. I avow it. I love her. Let me go where I may when I presently leave this house. I shall go into a blank life, leaving her. That I am incapable of a mercenary project or a mercenary thought in connection with Miss Wilfer is nothing meritorious in me, because any prize that I could get before my fancy would sink into significance before her. If the greatest wealth or the highest rank were hers, it would only be important in my sight as removing her still further from me and making me more hopeless, if that could be. Say that with a word she could strip Mr. Boffin of his fortune and take possession of it, she would be of no greater worth in my eyes than she is." And I love that speech. I think it is beautiful. It makes me very happy. And then let's quickly talk about one of my favourite bits in this chapter, one of my favourite bits in the whole book. Mr. Boffin tells Bella that she's now been righted. But Bella was so far from appearing to feel it that she shrank from his hand and from the chair, and starting up in an incoherent passion of tears and stretching out her arms, cried, "Oh, Mr. Rokesmith, before you go, if you could but make me poor again, oh, make me poor again, somebody, I beg and pray, or my heart will break if this goes on. Pa, dear, make me poor again and take me home. I was bad enough there, but I have been so much worse here. Don't give me money, Mr. Boffin, I won't have money." This is such an important turning point in the book, and so for me, like, so much of emotional climax of the book, because she like starts up in this kind of passion and just is like, no, I've had enough of all of this, a mess. I don't want to be part of this world. And again, it's this connection throughout Our Mutual Friend of money and rubbish, the idea that money can only ever bring evil, that money has corrupted Mr. Boffin in some deep way, and that Bella, feeling this, knows that she must reject it. It's interesting, in the TV adaptation of Our Mutual Friend, in the TV adaptation of this scene, I believe that Bella says, "Don't give me money, Mr. Boffin, I don't want money." But it's interesting that she doesn't say, "I don't want money." She says, "I won't have money." It's not just, this is not what I want, it's also, I know what's right and I'm standing by my principles. And I love that about Bella, because I think she is such an interesting, powerful, important character for the way she changes. I also think this is very interesting in terms of Dickens and gender, but in Dickens, in general, the heroines are always perfect. His female characters are always good, they're always perfect, they have their angelicism from the start, they don't go through moral transformations. That is not the same for his heroes. A lot of his male heroes, a lot of his male leads in his books go through transformations of bad to good, or of arrogant or whatever to good, of selfish to good throughout the course of the book. Someone like Martin Chuzzlewit, for example, in Martin Chuzzlewit goes on a big journey of character development from being, I think, thoughtless and selfish to being a much better man who can see the viewpoints of others around him much more clearly. You can make similar arguments about someone like James Harthouse in Hard Times, or Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities, even to a certain extent of Eugene Wrayburn in Our Mutual Friend, but there are very few female characters in Dickens that go through that kind of moral transformation, because in general for Dickens, morality in women is innate. It is, women are moral, men must become moral, they must conquer their own innate immorality, whereas women are just like naturally moral. And it's very interesting that in this, his last book, where I think his gender, his presentation of gender has changed so much over the course of his career, we do get Bella, who is the first female character who is really allowed complete character development. I mean, there are female characters who have slight character development. Someone like Nancy, for example, in Oliver Twist does have some sort of character development and some moving from immorality to morality, but it's not complete. She's not a heroine. She can never be fully moral because she has fallen, etc. This is beside the point. But what I'm trying to say is that it's very rare in Dickens to have a female character have this kind of character arc where they go from being selfish and being thoughtless into being moral and better. But it's very common amongst his male characters, and that's part of the reason why I think it's so interesting a plotline in Bella. And I mean, despite the fact that Bella does spend a good chunk of this chapter sobbing, I do think she also demonstrates her emotional strength in this chapter in her decision to leave the Boffin Dickens, who, despite everything, she does kind of love. Like, there's a really sort of touching and childish bit where she says to Mr. Boffin, "I hate you. At least I can't hate you, but I don't like you." And even when she leaves, even when she is furious with him, when she tells him that she is angry, not just upset, but angry, even when she leaves, she has to run back to hug him before she leaves, because some bit of her does still care about Mr. Boffin, and she is so devastated to see the change that money has made on him. And I think that's really important, and it does show her emotional strength, that she still leaves, that she leaves right away, that she puts away the fancy dresses and everything she's had, and she goes back to what she knows will be a better life, a life in which she can be more moral, and also a life in which she will be more independent. She says, "I'll leave all these presents behind and begin again entirely on my own account." This idea that she will not live off their money anymore and that she will begin her life as herself. This kind of strong self-identity, which I think is so important in Bella. So I think that is pretty much all I have to say on that chapter. I've tried to be as concise as I could, but I love this chapter a lot, and I think for a turning point in Bella's character, her being one of my favourite characters, and this magic, wonderful, emotional moment in the love story of John and Bella, which is one of my favourite love stories in Dickens. I think that moment is so nice and so perfect, and I love this chapter a lot. I just love the dialogue in it. It's just great. It's just beautiful. Moving on to the next chapter, chapter 16. The Feast of the Three Hobgoblins. In this chapter, Bella, having departed from the Boffins' house, goes straight to see her father. She doesn't quite know how to tell her father what she's done, so she kind of sits there and has tea with him at his offices until he realises that she's wearing an old dress, and she begins to try and explain. But just as she is about to explain to her father that her and Mr. Boffin have had a disagreement and she's left, Mr. Rokesmith turns up. Mr. Wilfer sees him through the window, is rather surprised, especially when Mr. Rokesmith comes in and, like, embraces Bella and claims her as his own. Bella's father is wonderfully and hilariously shocked by this. After they have a pleasant tea together and explain to Mr. Wilfer exactly what's going on, Bella goes back home with her father, meets her mother and sister, who are not very impressed with her having left the Boffins and are really not impressed with each other and just anything. And just after that, Bella has a little conversation with her father and promises him that once she's married, she will have a corner in her house where he can come when he wants quiet, to be away from his family, which is, aside from being like sweet of her, also just atrociously sad that he has to do that because he's so miserable. Anyway, let's talk about the things of interest in this chapter. Quickly, let's talk about the presentation of the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Wilfer, because I've mentioned this a few times before and it is a real point of interest in this book. In general, in all of Dickens, it's worth looking out for the presentation of married couples who have been married for more than a year, because in general they're all really, really miserable. Dickens likes to end his novels with marriage, a good sort of 4 or 5 if he's having a good day. And yet, despite that, despite the idealised ending of a perfect marriage, most of his married couples are really not very happy and are really quite miserable with each other. For all that Dickens is sometimes seen as this great advocate of domesticity, actually his presentation of married life is much more critical and much more solemn and miserable than that. And as much as Dickens seems to idolise marriage in the ending of his novels, I really think Dickens would have been a lot more in favour of divorce than a lot of other Victorians at the time, partly I think to do with his own unhappy marital circumstances. Mr. Wilfer admits that he can find his wife wearing. When they get home, his wife is angry with everyone. When Bella says to her father, "I am very, very sorry, dearest Pa, to have brought home all this trouble," her father replies, "My pet, don't make yourself uneasy about that. It is really not worth mentioning because things at home would have pretty much taken the same turn anyway." The fact that Bella promises her father that when she marries Mr. Rokesmith, there will be in her house a peaceful corner where he can come and be when home is too much for him. It's really sad. Like, they have a really unhappy married life. Let's talk about Lavinia for a moment. For all that she is quite rude and quite haughty in her own way, for all that were I George Sampson I would really not marry her, I think she is really quite hilarious. Don't talk about presuming, Ma, for goodness sake. A girl who is old enough to be engaged is quite old enough to object to being stared at as if she were a clock. It's great. I love her. Another moment I will briefly dwell on, although it is not of great significance, and there will be more to say later in the book on the subject of Bella and domesticity. But several chapters ago, when Bella went home to see her parents on their wedding anniversary and cooked for them and found that despite having cooked the chicken, it was not cooked and was pink inside and she didn't really understand why, Bella is one of the only heroines in Dickens who cannot cook. Bella is the least domestic heroine in all of Dickens, and Bella comes home on this occasion and she begins to make the salad, and her mother watches her quite angry because Bella's putting vinegar in there that her mother would rather not be there. Bella, even now she's had her moral transformation, she still can't cook, because often in Dickens, domesticity and morality go hand in hand. If you look at a character like Esther in Bleak House, even to a certain extent like Amy Dorrit in Little Dorrit, domesticity and morality so often go together, and it's quite nice in Bella that even now she's had her moral transformation, she can't cook yet. More on that another time. Then moving slightly backwards through the chapter, it's also interesting to look at the presentation of Bella and John's relationship when they are together as effectively an engaged couple. Pretty much, he runs up to her and says, "You are mine," and she says, "Yes, I am yours if you think me worth taking," which I feel is as good a proposal as any. And it's interesting, of course, to note that throughout this chapter, John is referred to as John Rokesmith, or Mr. Rokesmith, or Rokesmith. Because now he's not employed by the Boffins, Dickens can't get around the problem of his name by calling him the secretary, as he so often does beforehand. So now he has to be Mr. Rokesmith, because that's how Bella knows him, that's how her father knows him, and we don't see anything from his perspective. In fact, we haven't seen anything from John Harmon's perspective for a very long time. Since we found out he was John Harmon and he proposed to Bella Wilfer, we have seen next to nothing, I think, from his perspective. And so it's very, very interesting that here, when Dickens can no longer call him the secretary, when he calls him Mr. Rokesmith, it's kind of constantly enforced every couple of lines that he still hasn't told her the truth. He still hasn't told her who he is. This is problematic. They're going to get married and she still won't know what his name actually is. And yet they love each other, and the conversation between them and the fact that they're constantly kissing. I think they're kissing. Like, Dickens refers frequently to Bella vanishing into Mr. Rokesmith's arms, but it's not quite clear whether they're just like hugging or whether they're actually kissing. But personally, I like to imagine that they're kissing, and poor Bella's father is like really awkward about the fact that they're just like kissing next to him, and he's like, "Would you like to sit either side of me, please, and keep your hands off each other?" That bit really does quite entertain me, because it's not often that Dickens does anything to explore sexuality. In general, sexuality is very, very low down the scale of themes that Dickens explores in comparison to an author like Hardy or even like Gaskell. So it's quite nice to have a few small moments where Dickens actually hints that people might be attracted to each other. I feel like that is all I have to say about that chapter, so without any further ado, we'll move on to the next. Chapter 17, A Social Chorus. So chapter 17 is one of Dickens's great society chapters, where he gives us a little overview of what is going on in society at this point. To do with the various wealthy characters in the book, we find out that the Lamleys have now lost all their money and are going away. We have Mrs. Lamley visiting Mr. Tremlow to entreat him to keep her secret about Georgiana and to kind of keep Georgiana Podsnap safe in a way. She also tells him that she has now discovered that it is in fact Mr. Fledgeby and not Mr. Ryer who runs the debt collecting company, and that Mr. Tremlow should be on his guard of Mr. Fledgeby, even if Mr. Tremlow does not believe her without any proof. We then have a dinner party at the Veneerings, and during this dinner party, Eugene gets called outside by Mortimer Lightwood's sort of errand boy from the office and told that Mr. Doles is there. Jenny's drunken father has an address that Eugene Wrayburn has found Lizzie, and so we end book 3 on a dramatic moment with Eugene Wrayburn having found out where Lizzie is and working out what he is going to do about this fact. So, exciting drama set to be set up for book 4. Oh, it's so good! So good! So many exciting things to happen in the last quarter of this book. I'm excited. Anyway, points of interest in this. I just want to read you a bit from the beginning of this chapter because I love Dickens's descriptions of the society. I love his descriptions of the Veneerings and this world. I think his description of upper class society in the Victorian period in this book is at its very, very best. I love the kind of irony and social criticism of it, the wit, the tone. I think it is great. Amazement sits enthroned upon the countenances of Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Lamley's circle of acquaintance when the disposal of their first-class furniture and effects, including a billiard table in capital letters by auction under a bill of sale, is publicly announced on a wavering hearthrug in Sackville Street. But nobody is half so much amazed as Hamilton Veneering, Esquire, who instantly begins to find out that the Lamleys are the only people ever entered on his soul's register who are not the oldest and dearest friends he has in the world. I also think that Mrs. Lamley is very interesting in this chapter, as she is in all of them. I think she is such a fascinating character. Not that gender and morality is like my only theme today, but Mrs. Lamley is wonderful to look at in terms of gender and morality because she effectively has the same personality as Alfred Lamley, But for Dickens, because she is a woman, she must be that little bit better and that little bit kinder. Even when she can still be scheming and manipulative, she must have something different to him that is chiefly to do with her gender. Her gender gives her a kind of emotional intelligence and a sort of kindness in her heart that her husband does not have, even if she has repressed that kindness and even if her desire for money becomes above that. And yet she seems almost ashamed of her own kindness. She says to Mr. Tremlow, "I scarcely know why I turned traitress to my husband in the matter, for the girl is a poor little fool. I was a poor little fool once myself, I can find no better reason." She can barely admit to herself that she cared about Georgiana Podsnap and that she didn't want this girl to get hurt, because for her that would seem almost a kind of weakness, because she does not want to have that kind of emotional element to her personality, because she wants to be more than that. She wants to be sort of cold and calculating and mercenary, and she doesn't want to admit that she has feelings or affections for other people. Another thing to do with gender and her difference from Mr. Lamley is the way that basically what Dickens says in this chapter is that Mrs. Lamley is more intelligent than Mr. Lamley because she's a woman. One is just fascinating for the Victorian period, because that is what Dickens kind of says in this chapter, like she is much more intelligent than her husband because she's a woman. Because she's a woman and she has that kind of emotional intelligence. She has worked out that it is Fledgeby who is behind the money scheme. It is not Mr. Ryer at all, but her husband and Mr. Tremlow, being men, won't believe her. And of course what Dickens is doing here is very simplistic and stereotyped, but it's also quite important that he is saying that women are more intelligent than men, at least to a certain extent, or the women are more intelligent in more areas is probably specifically what he's saying, which is very important throughout Dickens. Men are very wise in their way, quoth Mrs. Lamley, but they have wisdom to learn. My husband, who is not over-confiding, ingenuous or inexperienced, sees this plain truth no more than Mr. Tremlow does, because there is no proof, yet I believe 5 women out of 6 in my place would see it as clearly as I do. Dickens presents here the idea that Mrs. Lamley gets what's going on because she's a woman and she has that kind of emotional intelligence, which is problematic in itself, but interesting in terms of Dickens's presentation of gender, because a lot of the time in Victorian literature it is not women who are presented as more intelligent, even if this is a particular kind of intelligence, I think. But yes, more on that perhaps another time. Again, we have the great social criticism at this party in which these very wealthy people are discussing how it is possible that the Lamleys could possibly have lived beyond their means, while their waiter looks on at all of the things they are eating and the way they are living, and he is pretty sure that he sees very easily how people could live beyond their means. This idea of the constant hypocrisy of society, how everyone is always playing a part, how just as they all had no idea that the Lamleys were bankrupt equally, any kind of one of them could be also bankrupt and no one would know. And then of course in the final few sentences of this chapter we discover that Eugene has got the address off Mr. Dole / Jenny's father, and that he now knows where Lizzie is. And so the big question, the dramatic cliffhanger set up for book 4 is what he's going to do with that, and what will happen when he finds Lizzie, and what will this mean for everyone in the book. And yes, oh, it's exciting. In the month of August we will be reading the following 4 chapters. Chapter 1, Setting Traps. Chapter 2, The Golden Dustman Rises a Little. Chapter 3, The Golden Dustman Sinks Again. And Chapter 4, A Runaway Match. I hope you're all continuing to enjoy our mutual friends so far. Please do let me know your comments down below how you enjoyed these few chapters, and if you enjoyed that chapter, The Golden Dustman at his worst, as much as I did. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.